All right, I wanted to welcome everybody to the Invasive Strike Force survey training. Today, we're going to be focusing on species ID to become an official Invasive Strike Force surveyor. Really excited to see everybody here. My name is Brent Boscarino. I'm the Associate Director of Stewardship at the Trail Conference, and I'm also the coordinator of the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, or the LH PRISM, and I'll be describing all of this in a little bit. Really excited to have you all here and participating tonight and on your way to becoming a surveyor for us. There's so many new faces here tonight that I at least wanted to give a shout out to the Trail Conference, what our organization, and why you're all here, as to how it all fits into preserving and protecting our natural areas. The Trail Conference has been around for over 100 years, and historically, we focused a lot on developing, building, and maintaining trails. So laying down tread, cutting back brush so that you can enjoy the outdoors and the trails in our areas and the beautiful vistas. But recently, we've expanded into a lot of other areas of responsible land stewardship. We do a lot of strategic management, monitoring, education, and outreach, and we now have our own stewardship department. Speaking of, we do lots of stuff here within the stewardship department. Christy Sabins is here tonight. Christy, you want to unmute and say hello?
Hello, everyone. Nice to see a bunch of new faces.
And Christy will be working with you all in addition to me and communicating with you on your survey assignment. And so, we do a lot here in the stewardship department, and Christy's a major part of that. We have an Invasive Strike Force crew. So you all are here to become surveyors, but we actually have seasonal AmeriCorps members that come out and do a lot of invasive species management and removal for us. And they just arrived a couple of weeks ago and are now beginning their season. And then, of course, you guys, the volunteers going out on the trails and helping us to survey for invasive species. We also have different types of removal volunteers. So we have our core crews or our AmeriCorps members, but we also have removal volunteers. Here's a picture of some of our volunteers dealing with the dreaded spotted lanternfly, which has moved into our area and we'll be learning about tonight. We also have dogs as part of our team. We have a conservation dogs program that looks for not only invasive species, but the native species along the trails and our trail systems that we're trying to protect. So it's not just all about the invasive species, but it's about the native habitats that we are protecting. And the dogs, great sniffers, great searchers. And of course, we need both human and dogs' help to really find what's out there and the diversity of life along in our natural areas. We also have a trail steward program that's been integrated within our stewardship department. These are folks, again, AmeriCorps members that are out at popular trailheads and do a lot of education and outreach for us. And as you'll be learning tonight, we've increasingly really had our hands in forest health monitoring. You'll be learning about beech leaf disease and how we are establishing monitoring plots and looking at the progression of diseases, both invasive species and just the health of our forests. Hemlocks is another initiative in which we're doing a lot of forest health monitoring as well. You'll be learning about that tonight. And as you notice, a stewardship department is really just about responsible use and protection of habitats, but why the invasive species focus? The Trail Conference has been around kind of working on trail systems for a long time, but why get the hands into invasive species? So first, let's just establish the baseline and as to why invasive species, why they matter and why they are important, why we're kind of tackling this as a trail conference. So first of all, invasive species is one that is transported from another region of the world and now is in our area, let's say Northeast forests, and it becomes established. And not only is it living here now in a place in which it hasn't evolved, it doesn't necessarily have natural predators to sort of control its population expansion, but it's spreading rapidly and is really kind of displacing a lot of the native species and causing a bit of havoc in ecosystems and native ecosystems that we all depend upon. So it either has a negative impact upon biodiversity, so as from an ecology perspective, but a lot of invasive species can really be a severe threat to the economy and in some situations even to human health. So invasive species, again, a non-native species brought here and is displacing a lot of our native species in our habitats. It's actually, in fact, invasive species is not just a local issue, but it's second only to habitat loss for its impact on biodiversity nationwide. variety of reasons and of how invasive species kind of threaten our native systems, but they crowd out native plants. You take a look at this. This is actually kudzu, I believe, is a invasive vine in this picture here, but it could easily be bittersweet that we have here as well, or invasive porcelain berry. There, you can't even tell what's growing underneath this like blanket of invasive vines. So it's degrading wildlife habitat. So the native wildlife that depend upon plants and the systems and habitat protection that our our native systems provide, degrading habitat for those wildlife, including birds, increase erosion of slopes, degrade aesthetics. So you're all here presumably because you love exploring the outdoors, but it's really difficult to even navigate on trails in systems like this. I mean, when you're swarmed with invasive species, and certainly the enjoyment of natural gardens. I'm sure many of you here tonight are gardeners, or just enjoy going out to areas and don't want to see just these vast monocultures of invasive plants. And again, we have a rich history here at the Trail Conference of trail maintenance and allowing, just recreation and enjoying that nature experience. And oftentimes what our trail maintainers are dealing with almost 95% of the time where they're cutting back brush is invasive species. So invasive shrubs, things like multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, impinging upon the trail tread and going through these systems. So invasive species are a big deal to our trail maintenance community as well. Variety of different reasons how invasive species can get here. Again, take a look at the stink bug, which I know I am constantly dealing with in my house, has moved in here just as a hitchhikers on crates being shipped from other countries. And then they sort of get released, either their egg masses kind of come over on shipping crates and now causing problems for fruits and orchards. This is very similar to spotted lanternfly. They suck out juices of fruits. And this has impact on both the economy and ecology of systems. And not only that, but they're a nuisance in our homes as well. But a lot of the ones that you're going to see along the trail system are really introduced on purpose. We call them ornamental plants because they're beautiful to look at. I don't know if you recognize some of these. They're not on our survey list this year, but this is Japanese barberry, beautiful flowers. And I virtually guarantee that almost everybody on this call has seen Japanese barberry, may have it in their own properties. Or bittersweet is another one, invasive bittersweet that is growing as a corkscrewing vine. Multiflora rose is another one that is very common in our area. But these were put here on purpose because, quite frankly, they're pretty, right? But what ends up happening is that what you put on your pergola in your yard as a good ornamental decoration then escapes into the wild, and now you've got bittersweet completely blanketing a tree to the point where you can't even tell what kind of tree is growing underneath there, right? So this is the sort of impact that invasive species can have. So as a message, I know that there's a lot going on in New Jersey right now in terms of legislation for prohibiting certain plants from being sold in nurseries. And here in New York State, we actually have prohibited plants that cannot be sold in nurseries anymore. But just be mindful next time you go out to a store or a garden center, and what you're putting on your property is just because you're not seeing it spread on your own property doesn't mean it's not getting into our natural areas and our trail systems. Birds will come eat these berries and then spread it. And now you've got a situation like this where you can't even tell what sort of tree is growing underneath there. So I wanted to at least put that out there. There's a lot happening in terms of legislation right now that you may be interested in. So I focused a lot on plants, right? And how plants are impacting native habitats, but it's really not just about the plants and outcompeting a lot of our native plants like spotted geraniums or something, or some kind of wildflowers you might be seeing. This is a really highly invaded ecosystem that you're seeing here, shrubs kind of overtaking the understory, but it's not just about plants against other plants. Just think about the native species and native plants that we're trying to protect here and what that means for our wildlife. So our birds depend on those berries of native berries for that kind of fat for overwintering, right? A lot of the invasive plants that we have now have berries, and yeah, birds will eat them, but they don't have the same nutritional content, especially for overwintering and what is needed to kind of fledge young. And so, it has a lot of cascading effects. Native plants, again, we have very close relationships with pollinators, things like monarch butterflies that depend upon that, insect populations, caterpillars for birds. They're all really have evolved very closely with native plants in our area. And when something new moves in and there are no predators in the system, it kind of breaks that balance, that natural state that is dependent upon. And I'll even put up a picture of trout here, native trout. We'll be talking about hemlocks tonight and what a foundational species and how important they are to kind of providing that cool shade for these cool streams that native trout depend upon. So it's not really just about plants overtaking other native plants. It's really about the habitats and native wildlife that they're protecting as well. So invasive species have a variety of different impacts in our region. And that's why we realized as a trail conference that something needed to be done. It couldn't just be like one-off kind of ad hoc groups going out there and removing invasive species. But I mean, this was really impacting the ecology of the systems that we love to recreate in and our native wildlife depend upon. And it was really kind of dismantling the nature experience. So, and the threats that we were finding and a lot of our volunteers were finding were much beyond standard trail maintenance work. And it really kind of required a coordinated approach at a regional and community-based level. And that's when New York State stepped in and said, okay, we just can't have little smaller groups kind of working separately from one another. We really need to build a partnership and a coalition of groups to kind of tackle invasive species in our region. And so they formed what are called these partnerships for regional invasive species management, and they divided them up by region. And essentially what these prisms or partnerships, think about it as like environmental coalitions between people concerned about invasive species management in our region. Well, it required a lead organization in the Lower Hudson area that actually came to the trail conference to kind of spearhead that effort to tackle the invasive species problem and create strategies of organizations working together towards common goals to bring back balance to these natural systems that we love to recreate in and our native wildlife depend upon. So that's when the Trail Conference stepped in. The Trail Conference has a really robust volunteer network and community members that love the Trail Conference, love to explore trails and explore the diversity of life on those trails. And we have a very strong presence in New Jersey. So just because the prisms themselves are based in New York State, we have such a great volunteer base in New Jersey that the survey work that you're here to learn about tonight is critically important in northern New Jersey, because a lot of the invasive species that we get in New York State are kind of moving up the East Coast from the South. And by learning about what's happening in New Jersey, we can also make good management decisions for what's happening in New York. Remember, invasive species know no boundaries, right? So we actually won a bid for a contract to run this prism, and it now consists of over 57 different environmental organizations. We formed the Invasive Strike Force and Stewardship Department to tackle a lot of this. And the Invasive Strike Force was formed about a decade ago to start surveying for invasive species. And that's what you're all here to learn about tonight. And that's community-based science, right? How can you become trained and have your eye out to look for things that are threats and we believe are high priorities in our area, so that we can make good, strong management decisions with our other partners? And we cannot do this without you all. That's why I'm so excited to have you all here tonight and see the kind of effort that it takes in this sort of teamwork of building in our area. And you're not just in isolation here. You're not one volunteer that's just coming out and surveying a trail. You're part of a huge partnership in our region. Again, 57 different regional partners and lots of volunteers. Just look at all the work we accomplished in 1 year together. We have over 4,000 volunteers that have dedicated their work towards invasive species work in northern New Jersey and the Lower Hudson area. We engage interns, we engage state agencies to work together. And the stuff that you are going to learn about tonight and we'll be reporting is going to directly lead to management priorities and management strategies that are going to make a difference for the parks that we love to visit. We have full-time staff that are working on this, but again, that relationship we have with our volunteers and us learning from what you're seeing on the ground, and then you learning from us as to what to be on the lookout for, that partnership is what really makes it go. And I can't stress that enough, how appreciative I am for everyone being here and taking the time to do this together. So with that introduction, I wanted to provide at least some context in the first 15 minutes as to why this work is important, the threat that invasive species pose to our native ecosystems, and what your role is in that. It's really part of a partnership and team effort so that we can make good decisions for the parks and natural areas that we love to explore and work in. All right, you all ready for start IDing some stuff? We've got 5 species that are on our list for 2023, and we can start putting that early detection rapid response model. Like, you're on the ground looking, and now you can report to us and we can put a management team together to go make a difference in our parks. So the first one that we're going to be talking about tonight, you may have come across as you're hiking, and this is a really recent development in our area. It's called beech leaf disease, and it's a disease that is unfortunately affecting a lot of the beech trees in our area that causes the kind of dark banding and tissue thickening in beech leaves in our region. It's actually really not clear as to what is the causative agent of this, but we do believe that it's caused, or this kind of like striping and tissue thickening that is preventing photosynthesis and eventually leads to like death of that tree, leads to overall reduction in canopy cover and eventual death. We believe it's caused by a nematode worm. We know that these nematodes are highly correlated with this symptom of this dark banding. We know that nematodes overwinter in the buds, and then as it begins to, like around now, as the leaves are starting to come out, those nematodes migrate from the buds or the base of the leaf out into the leaf. And that's when during the summertime where they really build up their numbers. In fact, like after a rain, you can have thousands of these worms can swim out from one leaf and then cause infection and start to infect other beech trees around it. Beech leaf disease was first discovered in 2012. You can see in northeastern Ohio. Just to orient you this, the yellows and blues were found really early on in the infestation, and the pinks and the purples were really found within the last 3 to 4 years or so. As you can see in our region, what started in like Canada and eastern Ohio, we think that probably through the nursery trade of beech trees, it arrived in our area very recently and is now spreading really rapidly. And it's not just in lower New York and northern New Jersey, but we're now finding in other states like New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, and even Rhode Island now. I forgot to put that on here. So this is something that is spreading very rapidly. Again, early symptoms are going to look like this: dark green striped bands between the leaf veins. This is going to impair photosynthesis. And as I'm going to show you in a video very soon, eventually it progresses to the point where it's almost like leathery leaves, where it becomes very, very dark, very thick and shriveled. And typically death occurs in saplings, so beech saplings, so smaller trees. The mature ones have some kind of will continue to leaf out for multiple years. And I don't even know if in our region we've seen a large mature tree die, but in Ohio, that usually takes like 5 or so years, versus the saplings can die within a couple of years. But we do know that if one tree has it, very likely all the trees around it are going to be impacted. So if we are going to be looking for beech leaf disease, we first need to be able to determine what a beech tree is and how to look for that itself. So I'm going to show you a video on how to identify not only beech leaf disease, but beech trees themselves. You'll notice that when videos stream over Zoom, they'll be a little like jumpy from one scene to another, but as soon as I get focused in and start using my hands, it'll come into more focus and you'll be able to like see the features a little bit better. So this video is going to do a little bit of a reminder as to how to ID beech trees through both its leaves and its trunk, and then bring you through how to identify beech leaf disease and help us combat that threat in our region. The first sign to look for that you're looking at a beech tree and not another type of tree is its bark. And a lot of people liken the bark of a beech tree to almost like elephant legs. You can see why. It's got like a grayish appearance to it. And as I'm feeling it, It's very, very smooth. Unfortunately, a lot of you get a lot of carvings and stuff on the sides of beech trees, which are not promoting at all. But again, it's just got this like very smooth appearance to it. It almost looks just like a little joint there of an elephant leg or something. So that's one of the first features to be on the lookout for. Also, its leaves, because sometimes, especially with saplings and stuff, you may not get that sort of smooth bark, but as it matures, it becomes even more obvious. But if you look at the beech leaf itself, there's a little trick that I'll have you guys think of. So when you think of beech and like going to the beach and waves, you see how this leaf right here, if you look at the surface of it where my finger's coming up there, doesn't that look like little wave crests, like you're going to the beach? So you see these little like teeth that are on that? Just think of them like wave crests, like you almost like a cartoon drawing or something of like waves on a beach. That's how I think about beach leaves. It's a great way of just kind of a quick mnemonic to help you guys know you're looking at beech leaf. And that's a little trick that I use. Just it looks like little wave crests, like you would see if you did a little like artistic rendering of what waves might look like, kind of cresting up there. So in other words, each of these veins that's coming off that mid rib of the leaf in the middle there, so right where my thumb is, kind of, you see those veins, they're coming to a there you go, coming to a point. So that's like one of the main features. Now the main thing though, so again, elephant skin bark, right? Very smooth, and then beech crest, like wave crests on it. But if you really want to look for beech leaf disease and want to know what that's looking for, you really got to kind of go underneath the trees and look straight up to look for the stripes. And I'm going to show you that right now. I had of scanning the canopy and sort of that beautiful, brilliant look you have to the canopy as you're looking up while you're hiking. Well, do you notice something a little bit off and strange about that as I'm looking up into the canopy here? Take a look at some of these leaves here. Do you see that striping that's appearing as you're looking up into the canopy? So I'm going to pause the video there, right? Over here, can you all see my arrow? That's a healthy looking beech leaf on that same tree. But right here, if you're looking up into the light, that's got very, very clear striping. That is the sort of striping you're going to see when you're looking up into a beech tree with that level of like symptomatic tissue, right? So that dark banding and striping. What you're also going to see is if certain leaves, like you can see it right here, you see how this leaf right here is very, very dark. So if I zoom in on that later in the video, you'll see that it can actually, if it's super progressed and not just striping, it can actually become very leathery. Version of beech leaf disease. You can see that that darkness becomes like more prevalent throughout the leaf itself. Although even if you looked at up through light up towards the canopy, you'd still probably see a bit of striping. But this is what it looks like when it's really progressed, like dark, crinkly, very, very thickened. And as I'm touching it, it almost feels like rawhide. Like, I mean, it is very, very thick. And what I didn't mention before is, so that's when it's really bad and super progressed, but typically you're going to see some leaves that have that characteristic banding, and that's how you know that you are looking at beech leaf disease. And I want to make a point, if you're scanning the canopy, so this is kind of a screenshot of what you were just looking at before, there's a difference between stripes and that banding on the leaf, and then just shading and shadow. You see how that's this area right here? That's just the shadow of one leaf in front of another. Like that's all that is right there. But right here, that is striping on the leaf. Okay, so that's a big difference. You got to look for those stripes and not just like you're looking at a shadow of a leaf that's behind another. All right, maybe you could possibly get confused between beech leaves and birch. So birch trees have that sort of like papery bark to them. But if you look at the leaves, you see how much more serrated it is. Like if you have a knife to cut tomatoes or something, you have just more serrations on that knife. Well, birch trees have much more serrated edges versus like the beech leaves have more like wave crests at each of the veins. The only other thing that you could possibly confuse beech leaf disease with, there are some other diseases that you could find on beech leaves. Beech anthracnose is actually, you can see it's almost like like necrotic tissue that forms on the edge, but that almost looks like the leaf is being burned and it turns like brown. It's not like the dark banding that you would see with beech leaf disease. You can also get mites that will feed on beech leaves, but you see how this is more like yellowish, and it's really only going to see that striping on one side of the leaf because it's just a mite that's kind of coming across and taking off the food. Essentially, it's like the chlorophyll or whatever of that leaf. But if you see on the other side, it doesn't have that striping. It's more like just pocketing, right? So this is the only other things that you can possibly confuse it with, but really it's that dark banding that is really distinctive of beech leaf disease. And the only other thing I want to add about beech leaf disease in general, and just like a good, method of like education, outreach sort of messaging, is that if you are someone who likes to camp and you say you go up to the Adirondacks, we go up there all the time, is that we have a lot of forest pests here that we don't have in other regions. So make sure that wherever you're going camping, that you're not bringing firewood with you, because a lot of these things we think are being moved to other areas. So things like emerald ash borer, maybe beech leaf disease, we do not want to introduce those things to other areas. In fact, $4.4 billion per year in damages and management is thought to be due to firewood transmission alone. 140 different forest pests and disease known to be moved through firewood each year. So this is a major vector for spread, and we really need to do a better job about that moving forward. There is some management hope. We don't know what's causing beech leaf disease, but there's a lot of research and effort going into this. Right now, there's not currently any cure. We're not even sure if it's caused by those nematode worms, but some soil treatments have shown some promise by adding calcium to soils or potassium phosphites. There are some like experimental work going on with like, if we have better soil quality, that a lot of maybe the beech trees can kind of come through this. We've also formed what's called a beech leaf disease coalition, and this was born out of a Lower Hudson Prism working group. And this is a lot of local agencies, environmental groups working together for how to solve this problem. A lot of their efforts, since there is no known cure for it right now, is really looking at, okay, if we lose the beech canopy, how do we bring back native plants so that what's coming up in the next generation is going to survive and thrive? So they're doing a lot of work with deer exclosures, invasive species removals, so that if we do get a lost canopy due to beech leaf disease, how do we still allow native plants to come back so we can have good, strong habitat to support our pollinators and native wildlife in those areas? So a lot of good work is going into this. So as you go out and survey for beech leaf disease, just be mindful there's a lot of people that are working on these issues and working really hard to combat this threat and make sure that the next generation is going to be strong and look good. All right, so along those same lines, where the second species that we're going to be talking about today is another forest pest, and it is called hemlock woolly adelgid. And you might have seen this kind of white cottony masses on a lot of hemlocks in our region, but this is the second species that you're going to be looking for. And again, you're looking for a symptom versus like a little critter this time. So, but before we get into the actual forest pest that's causing this damage to hemlocks, let's talk about hemlocks in general. So first of all, hemlocks are a super important tree. They're the third most common tree in New York State, really prevalent in the Adirondacks, and they're a little bit more patchy down here in our region in northern Jersey and the lower Hudson Valley, but they are a critically important foundational species. And what that means is that they essentially create the ecosystem in which they reside. Mature hemlock trees, as they grow up, they create certain shade conditions and soil conditions that support a whole plethora of like native wildlife and plants and understory growing beneath it. So they create very unique soil and water conditions that support native diversity of life in a lot of the areas in which they thrive. So things like deer, moose, grouse, porcupines, they all utilize hemlock habitat, and that really support a lot of native understory shrubs. So again, they're kind of create certain conditions for them to thrive. one of the main services that hemlocks provide is that they're often found along streams and shorelines. They actually have a very shallow root system that is great for filtering out pollutants and preventing things like erosion. So they help filter out agricultural runoff from entering the drinking supply. And they're really like good indicators of good water quality and health. They provide shade necessary to create ideal water conditions for things like cold water fish, our native trout species, to reproduce and flourish. So again, they provide great ecosystem services, not only for like plants, but native wildlife that depend upon those plants. All right, so there is a huge need to preserve our hemlocks. If you have gone out to a hemlock area, typically in our region, you'll see like a lot of symptoms of this hemlock woolly adelgid. The adelgid is kind of like an aphid-like pest that came from southern Japan, and they're really impacting eastern hemlocks in our area. There's a lack of natural resistance to the hemlock woolly adelgid in our region, and we're dealing primarily with eastern hemlocks. I will say that the hemlock woolly adelgid, this little aphid-like pest, does coexist on the West Coast with western hemlocks, and they have natural predators there to kind of contain them. But here in the East, there's no known natural like predators of hemlock woolly adelgid, which is why they've really devastated the forests here, and they're really starting to spread. So this area of light green is the natural range of hemlocks in our area, and the darker green area is the hemlock woolly adelgid range. They were thought to be limited by climate conditions, but as you know, the climate begins to change, longer growing seasons and such, we found them creeping up more north than is typical for their range. So this is a really important issue. And so your eyes on the ground are going to be extremely important for looking at things like lingering hemlocks or those that have shown resistance to this pest. This is what is typical of when hemlock woolly adelgid has sort of moved through an area. It really weakens the needles, they fall off, and you see this like ghosting of like essentially like dead trees. So you might have seen this on ashes as well, as another forest pest move through to deal with ashes. But this is typical of, you know, areas where it's like skeletons of trees where the adelgid has moved through. So again, these are little tiny things causing really big changes. So what really is hemlock woolly adelgid, and how does it cause its damage? Well, it's a little bug. It's an aphid-like insect. And you can see that during this time in the summer, during the summertime, they almost look like a little black sesame seed. And again, you're not going to be looking for the actual insect itself. You'll see its byproduct of the cotton woolly mass. But just so you know, the bug itself looks like a little like bed bug or something, if you really zoom in on what it looks like. And it has this little feeding stylet. And that feeding stylet, this little like spaghetti-like looking mouth part, they essentially inject that into the base of a hemlock needle. What that does is it causes a wound in the hemlock that is attempting to heal. But in that process of trying to heal itself from this wound from this insect, it actually stops flow of nutrients and water to the needles of the hemlock, which then leads it to like starve to death, lack of new buds, and to eventually lose the needle. So it's this feeding mouth part that causes that damage, that tissue damage, that then causes it to lose its needles. The only other thing that I want to point out is you'll look at this is a segmented insect. And in between those segments, it actually creates a little woolly, like almost like a spitting out wool that comes through that. And it's that feature that you all will be looking for. This cottony mass on hemlocks is something that this insect is releasing out through its back or through these pores. Okay. And it's that cottony mass that you're looking for as surveyors. And we'll get into more details of that in a second. I did want to say that the reason why we're focused on this is that, again, there's hope for hemlocks. It always takes a while for biocontrol or predators to be approved and then released in our area, but we're now starting to get these more accessible. And there's actually two different types of beetles or predators that feed exclusively on hemlock woolly adelgid. The one over here, there's actually, this one is from native Japan where they coexist, but this is the one that's actually being released in our area. This is a West Coast predator called the Laricobius beetle, or sometimes called Little Larry. And it actually feeds, it's native to the Pacific Northwest and keeps hemlock woolly adelgid under control on Western hemlocks. So they're releasing it here for both adult and larvae of these beetles will feed on hemlock woolly adelgid during the winter months, and they'll feed on HWA eggs and young adults. There's also a second predator, and I'm going to show you a video on that in a second, that we are releasing in this area. This is called a silverfly, and they are abundant predators of hemlock woolly adelgid in the West Coast, and their larvae feed on prey of eggs of HWA during HWA's spring egg laying season. So you've got this beetle that will feed on it during the winter months, and then this silverfly that will actually feed on it during the spring. And so we hope to be able to like knock out or really kind of keep hemlock woolly adelgid under control. So we don't have to resort to chemicals all the time, but this is a great way. This is the only thing that they feed on. So I just want to provide that context that you're not surveying for no reason. We're really trying to find like areas in which the hemlocks look healthy enough for, maybe biocontrol to kick in, and that we can actually have good, strong management strategies to do something about it. So without further ado, I did want to get into like, if you're looking for hemlock woolly adelgid, you first need to figure out what hemlocks look like and how they differ from other conifers. So we'll be looking at some of the features. This is actually a hemlock tree in silhouette. They have very feathery branches. They're not quite as thick or as robust as, say, like a pine tree in terms of needles. And their cones are actually really distinctive as well. But the first thing that I would say is that let's look for an evergreen. And when you see an evergreen growing along your trail section you've been assigned, then take a look at the branches. The branches are really going to be your key, and not only like looking for cones, but the needle arrangement within that. Hemlock trees in general have a very feather-like appearance to it. So if you pulled off a bird feather and you looked at it, here would be like almost the base of a feather. And then you're going to see the needles are arranged almost in 2 dimensions, that they like almost like a bird feather would come out like right next to one another. It's very, very feathery. Versus like a spruce tree, which is another conifer you would find in our area. You see how the needles are very like saggy? I think of like saggy spruce, where the needles kind of hang down thick. If you're looking at a hemlock, they're very like feathery, light. It's not as dense as like a saggy spruce. If you really want to get into the details of the needles, this is really where you're going to see the difference. So notice how the hemlock needles, a couple of different things. If you look at the top of a hemlock branch, you'll see that it's a really dark glossy green. But if you look at the bottom of it, you see how there's these 2 little almost like racing stripes that are kind of whitish? And look at the needle arrangement on a hemlock. It's really almost 2 dimensions. Like there's a needle popping up here, and then opposite of that stem, there's another one popping out here. Let's contrast that with a spruce. You see how these needles on the spruce are going around and almost entirely encircling this, like almost in 3 dimensions, versus the hemlock needles are coming out almost in 2 dimensions. There's one coming out there and another coming out there. So that's one way to tell the difference between them. Also, you'll notice that the hemlock needles are a little bit more rounded on the edge there, versus the spruce, it's like, ooh, I just got pricked with a needle. Okay, so that's another difference. It is rare, but you might find fir trees out on the trails. That's really more common up in the Adirondacks than it is here. But there's a couple of ways to tell the difference as well between like a fir tree and a hemlock. Again, you notice how the needles on a fir, that they're going all the way around the twig, versus like on a hemlock that's really in 2 dimensions. You'll also notice how that needle on a fir is stuck onto that twig. It almost looks like a suction. It's almost like it's like a suction cup on that branch, versus a hemlock is more of an extended root to it, or the base that's connecting to that. All right, contrast that with a pine tree. Pine trees are actually really easy to tell because their needles, as opposed to just coming in one at a time onto that branch. Pine trees, they come in bundles. I don't know if you've ever stopped to notice, but it's kind of cool. Like all pine trees, they come together attached to twigs by pegs and bundles of 2, 3, or 5. And if they come in at 2 or 3 or 5, that'll tell you that the species of pine it is. But honestly, I just like the comparative method and the mnemonic device. Pines are poofy. Like if you've ever played with a koosh ball, that's a pine tree. Okay, pine trees are like more koosh-like in appearance versus hemlocks are just like laid out flat, kind of more flatter. This is a really three-dimensional structure to it. If you can find cones on it, that's the best way to do it. Hemlock cones are so cute. They're like really tiny and they're only like an inch maybe long. You compare that to something like a spruce pine or spruce cone. It's much longer. It almost looks like I'm sorry to be gross here, but like a turd or something versus like hemlocks are really cute. They're like small little cones. And a pine tree, I mean, you all know what pine cones look like, right? A little bit longer, a little more conical in shape. Spruce, again, very elongated like a banana or something. Hemlocks, really cute little things. All right. So the overall goal of our survey for hemlocks is, this is what your mission is essentially. Hemlock woolly adelgid has really devastated our area. It's caused a lot of issues. We see a lot of skeletons. So I am hoping that as a survey team and us cumulatively can go walk a trail and see if we can find some stands that are not yet severely impacted by HWA. They might have the adelgid on them, but maybe they're not so far gone that like if we do end up releasing some of the biocontrol that they may be saved. We can also find potential lingering hemlock trees. So say you've got an area like this where you see a lot of death of hemlocks or like really weakened hemlocks, but amongst that group, you find a really strong, robust one. That gives us good hope that we can actually take do genetic testing on that tree. What's giving it that type of resistance in that area? And there's good hope for like essentially creating grafts and things of resistant hemlock trees that we can later plant. Hopefully that makes sense, but I just wanted to point out that these are things that are ongoing right now and are high level science, and we really need boots on the ground to come find these healthy hemlocks. That was a lot of like PowerPoint slides there, so I did just want to show a really brief video that will show you some comparisons right next to one another of like, say, a healthy hemlock branch and then one that's really severely impacted by hemlock woolly adelgid. Is infested with hemlock woolly adelgid. Okay, here we go. All right, now that we've gone over the hemlock ID, I really wanted to put right next to each other a healthy hemlock twig right next to an unhealthy. Can you see the difference in color? Like it's a real stark difference. Dark glossy green, healthy versus like just looks weak and diseased. The one right there that is infested with hemlock woolly adelgid. So here is that feathery appearance of a healthy hemlock I was talking about. You see that deep green that's here, right? On the one side of it, very, very deep green. You can see how this almost like two-dimensional structure to it, right? You see how they lay flat, those rounded tips I was talking about before, and very, very glossy, right? So as I flip this over to the underside, you can also see those white sort of racing stripes that you're seeing there as well, right where my finger is. You see how that white kind of pops out? Well, let's contrast that with a branch that I found in our area with hemlock woolly adelgid infestation, right? So here is a branch infested with it. Okay, so that's that white cottony mass, and they're again going to be at the base of the needles, and sometimes you can even see the black marks, you can see the bug, but really you're looking for the white cottony masses to know what you're looking at. All right, so that is your hemlock and hemlock woolly adelgid ID. All right, so species number 3. I'm going to assume at this point that a lot of you have seen spotted lanternfly. And it is one of these things we are not going to stem the advance of, but we are hoping to kind of slow down the movement of spotted lanternfly in our region and really kind of protect the natural areas that we treasure and are either really important economically or like have really high recreational value. And that's why like doing trail surveys is actually really important, because we are not finding them very much along trails in natural areas. They're in more disturbed areas. But just to give you a little bit of a background on them, they arrived in around 2014 in Pennsylvania. They're native to China and Vietnam, and they probably got here we believe they got here on stone pallets from Eastern Asia. This is a invasive plant hopper. So they actually like jump, they can fly in their adult stage, but they kind of jump around more than that. They're not great flyers. They feed on over 70 different host species, but their primary host, and what we're going to be focusing on for the survey, is tree of heaven, or others might say it by its genus name, or Alanthus. So not only is this like potentially impacting our natural areas, but it's a nasty agronomic crop pest. So they feed on grapes, hops, apples, but they'll feed on a host of other trees that we have growing in natural areas, things like maples, walnuts, prunus, and other shade trees. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on their biology, but if you are going out surveying now, most of the egg masses, which almost look like scraped putty, you're not going to see anymore, because they actually started hatching within the last couple of weeks. We had sort of like a couple of really warm days, and they underwent a hatch. So right now, they go through different stages of development. They're an insect, so they actually have to shed their exoskeleton to grow. So as they go through it, they go through 3 stages in which they're black with polka dots. It's really super distinctive, but it's important so you know like the scale. Like these are very, very small right now, and I'm going to show you like a video of like the kind of really they are tiny. I just saw them the other day and was doing some like treatment on them. They're very, very small. It's at this stage that they're like, again, when they emerge, they feed on succulent growth. So really kind of like new fresh leaves, like vines, grape leaves, things like that. And less on sap. They're not strong enough. Their mouth part that they sort of inject into a side of trees is not strong enough yet to go into trunks of trees. So they're feeding on leaves and things like that. They'll feed on garden plants, things like roses, viburnums, peonies, and vegetable plants as well. So during the next couple of months, you're looking for this black stage of development. And I'm just going to show you someone else's video of like just what they look like. I mean, look, there's nothing that really looks like that. It's super distinctive. I mean, what a ladybug may, I don't know, but that doesn't look like a ladybug. It's got like a really extended mouth, and like these polka dots. So, but I do want to show you the scale of this, so you know the size of what you're looking at.
Going to be really bad, and I'm sure they will.
See how it just jumped away?
They really like the agricultural crop.
Okay. Ooh.
They love to feed.
It's blurry, but you can see this gentleman's hand. That's his finger. Okay, that is like a finger that he's at. This is really small.
On grapes and hops. I don't know how that's going to affect our beer industry.
So like think about your pinky nail. That was his pinky nail. It's about the size of a pinky nail right now, or if not smaller. They're very, very small, but they do tend to congregate. So like think about like if you see, and you might see one ant, for example, but you're going to see lots of ants. So you're really kind of looking for a lot of them growing on a host tree.
And all sorts of other crops. They also like the timber affecting different trees, which can greatly compromise our timber industry and different types of wood. We already have several.
I don't know what else to say. It's super distinctive, but they're small. If you go out surveying a couple months from now, they're going to get into a more of a reddish development. So they shed their skeleton and then they start becoming more red. So I'm going to show you what that looks like, but this probably won't happen till like July time.
They're very fast insects. They definitely run pretty quick. And when they need to, they just jump away in the blink of an eye. Really hard to film. Of course, they suck the juices of plants, including a lot of important
This is like what I'm used to seeing. I guess you could confuse it with a ladybug, but again, it's got like a long like snout at the end that ladybugs lack. It's less round. And just, they really do have beautiful colors, the red, white polka dots with some black that's mixed in. Now later in the year, they're going to turn into adults. And I just want to show you what that looks like. You've probably seen lots of pictures of them. It's super obvious at this point. This is when they start flying, and they're really beautiful creatures. But they they can do some serious damage to fruit trees. So again, you're looking for the black version of them because that's over the next couple of weeks through, like I would say, for about the next month or so. All right. As to why it's become so successful, well, there's a number of different reasons. So first of all, it's a really prolific reproducer. It replaces itself with 17 of them every year on average. So they tend to form swarms. What you'll find is that if you see one, you're probably going to see a lot. They tend to congregate on what are called hot trees, meaning that if you, again, they kind of like, they release a chemical that attracts others to it. So you rarely see one in isolation. They're kind of bunched together and they tend to feed on a tree that another one is feeding on. They have very few natural predators. There have been instances where chickens and in farms and stuff will feed on them. I've seen praying mantis that actually will feed on them as well. And lots, they get caught in spider webs a lot. But at this point, it's the predation is not enough to keep its numbers at bay. There just is not enough predators that have recognized it as a food resource to kind of keep its numbers low. There is hope for biocontrol down the road. They do have natural predators in its home country. Parasitoids, so like parasitoid wasps, provide some hope down the road for biocontrol, but that usually takes a while to get approved. Again, they feed very similar to hemlock woolly adelgid. They've got this long mouthpiece that, especially when they get to be adult stage, they can feed on like right through the trunk of really hard trees, and they suck out the sap, which essentially stops the nutrient flow from getting to the rest of the plants. And just remember, this is a little tiny bug that's continually sucking sap and nutrients out of a tree. So it would literally explode if it kept doing that. So what does it do? Well, the sap moves through its system, but so much is coming in that it has to come out the other end. And that's where they get to like the gross part, is that they're constantly excreting this honeydew solution out the other end. So imagine its sap is coming in one end and then a honeydew solution, a sugary solution is coming out the other end. And what ends up happening is that if you're standing under a tree with a lot of spotted lanternfly in it, it almost feels like it's raining. So it's raining kind of like excrement, that like nasty sort of sugary solution. And that is a great growing media for things like mold. And if you see a really highly infested tree that has a lot of honeydew raining down, you start seeing black sooty mold start to grow. And you'll also see stinging insects and things start to congregate. So I tell surveyors, if you see a lot of like yellow jacket or bee activity, there may be spotted lanternfly around because they're actually really attracted to that sugary solution that they use to make honey. In fact, we're finding that bees in our area are incorporating spotted lanternfly. There's actually DNA and stuff in honey now. It's like becoming part of the honey solution and things that they're making. You'll see that it's a really kind of a nuisance pest. These are the egg masses it lays, and just they almost look like putty that's like scraped on things, and they'll lay their eggs on almost everything. So they're just sort of a nuisance in and around properties. Not only that, but especially if you got big numbers like this, that's all adult spotted lanternfly feeding on an apple tree. This has been devastating to loss of crop damage in Pennsylvania where they first appeared. And we have a really big apple wine industry. The vineyards we're really trying to protect, because once spotted lanternfly move in, they feed on hops, in vineyards that provide wine for our region. So this is a big deal for a lot of people. So a lot of effort is going into keeping them out. Again, this sounds and looks bad, but honestly, as a homeowner, they're no human health threat. They don't bite. They're not going to bite you. They don't transmit disease. They're not really like huge in terms of property damage. You don't find them in inside houses a lot, like stink bugs that come into your homes. They typically don't. They don't eat wood. And in fact, they don't actually generally kill the larger trees. They might weaken them, but they generally don't kill them. They're just mostly like a nuisance pest. And I will say that the reason why we're focused on them is that we've really developed a multifaceted approach to management. And we are prioritizing areas of high recreational value and economic value to really put a lot of energy and effort in protecting. We've deployed our conservation dogs program to go in areas to scout boundaries of infestation, at transportation hubs to keep them out from moving farther. We are using a combination of pesticides, but also manual removal. I have found, honestly, and is actually an official treatment now by ag and markets, to use vacuum harvesters. Like, I'm literally with a backpack vacuum sucking these things up now, and you can get them by like the thousands. So if it's a property thing, I'm highly recommending doing that. As long as you get rid of the bag as soon as you put it. I take the bag from my backpack vacuum, put it in a sealed Ziploc bag, and kind of crush them and leave them there. It is a great way of getting rid of spotted lanternfly. So there's a lot of different methods that I can talk about more later, but just to let you know, there's a lot of people working on this. All right, so that's spotted lanternfly. The areas in which what you really need to do is find its main host tree, which is Ailanthus, or the tree of heaven. And this is a couple of different pictures of it right here. So Ailanthus is its main primary host. If you're on a trail section on your trail survey, this is what you're looking for. And then if you find a tree of heaven, then you're going to be looking for spotted lanternfly. So I'm going to go through some of the features of what its main host tree or tree of heaven looks like in a second here. All right, so first of all, tree of heaven was introduced in the late 1700s as a shade tree. I think that there's a book called what is it called? Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and it's actually features Ailanthus. It's a good shade tree that was introduced to the city. It's really hardy. It can grow through like sidewalk cracks, and that's why it's become so invasive and pervasive. It's really good at growing in bad conditions. It has what's called a pinnately compound leaf. You know how I talked about the hemlock twig? It looks like a feather, right? So these little leaflets that are coming off of it, again, look like you almost plucked a feather from a bird. And this part right here is what connects to the tree. It's almost like a big palm leaf. In fact, this whole thing is actually considered a leaf. It's called a big compound leaf, and these are leaflets. Like it's a deciduous tree, so when it falls off, it's not these individual leaflets that are falling off. It's actually the whole thing. It's like a big frond, like falling off the thing. And the leaves will range from 1 to 4 feet in length. They've got smooth margins. So if I looked at the leaf itself, it's actually no serrations, no like teeth marks on the edge, except for at the base. At the base, you're going to see a little notch on that leaflet. And if you look really close, it actually is like a little nipple, like almost like a little gland there. And it secretes, if you've ever dealt with tree of heaven on your property, it secretes a substance that smells bad. It's like rancid peanut butter, or almost like it's a very oily secretion that it gives. It's like almost like a rubbery, like burnt rubbery kind of scent to it. Some people will say rancid peanut butter. I don't know if I've ever smelled rancid peanut butter, but like people will say that. But that is that gland and that notch at the base of the leaflet. Now, remember, this is actually what I almost always look at is, remember how I said this big leaf on a tree of heaven falls off? When a leaf falls off a tree, I didn't know this before I started like doing this teaching of plants, it leaves behind a scar, like on the twig, on the stem. And so you can actually look at where leaves have fallen out. This is actually where a new bud is. But when that huge leaf falls off, it leaves behind a scar that looks like almost like V-shaped or heart-shaped. And I often think of like tree of heaven and heaven as love, or a sign of love or something, like almost like this heart-shaped leaf scar that it leaves behind. You'll also notice that if you look at a twig of a tree of heaven, it's got little white bumps on it. Those bumps are called lenticels, and that actually is used for oxygen exchange on trees. So you can look for bumps or in and around the leaf scar of the twigs. If you really wanted to get into details and cut into a twig, it's kind of cool that a lot of our trees have like a Twinkie filling in them. If you cut into that, the Twinkie filling would be brown on a tree of heaven. I'm not expecting anyone to do that, but these are just all different features that you can look at. The other thing that you could look for are the seeds. You can look at the basically like the fruiting structure of tree of heaven, and they're called samaras. they like, if you've ever seen like maple seeds, like they've got wings to them and they're almost like papery wings. Those are called samaras, and they tend to grow in bunches. So they're yellowish probably right now, but they turn kind of pinkish. But in the wintertime, it almost looks like it's leaves, but they're actually the seeds. They look like big eyeballs to me, like extended oblong eyeballs or with the seeds. And if you felt them, they'd feel very papery. The other thing that I look at that I think, if you've ever held or felt a cantaloupe, that is what the bark of Tree of Heaven looks like. It's also called Tree of Heaven because it grows straight up to heaven. It's like a really narrow trunk and it grows straight up. And I feel like it resembles cantaloupe when you feel it. I think the best thing that I can do for you right now is to show you a video of what it looks like in the field. I think, yeah, this is it here, so that you can see the different variations of what a young Tree of Heaven looks like and what a larger Tree of Heaven looks like. In this part of the park, I wanted to show you a couple of different versions of what Tree of Heaven looks like when it's really young, then also when it's mature at this time of year. I'm filming this on June 26th to give you a good sense. But you can see this big tree here. Do you see how it's got that cantaloupe rind look to it that I mentioned in the PowerPoint? And if you look up, I know it's going to be a little bright up there, but it's got almost that like palm tree kind of look to it. So as you can see here, you know, it's got those opposite leaflets that are coming off of it, but I can tell from that sort of like cantaloupe rinds that I'm looking at a Tree of Heaven. But let's take a quick look at this one here, which is really low to the ground, and you can see what it looks like when it's immature or a very young version of the Tree of Heaven. Remember how I told you that you can look at the leaf scars? Well, here's a really good look at the leaf scar here. Remember, it's got almost like that heart shape to it, like Tree of Heaven, love. Okay, so that's the bud, and that is that, like, it almost looks like Pac-Man swallowing the bud. Okay, that's another way to think of it. And those are the lenticels that I mentioned before. Hearts, and this is where the big leaves. Remember that these are big leaves that consist of leaflets. So what you're looking at here will eventually, this whole thing is a leaf, and where it connects to that stem, that will eventually fall off and then leave these little leaf scars behind, as you can see here. So again, that leaf scar is a good way to look at it. And you can take a look at the bark. It's got all those lenticels and then the leaf scar here. Let's take a look at these leaflets and what they look like. So remember that these are very, very smelly, and the leaflets are coming off opposite of one another. And if I zoom in very, very close there, let's take a quick look. Hopefully it focuses. You see right above where my thumb is, that little notch there with the gland on it. And that is what's going to give it that distinctive odor. So if I pulled this off, right, crunch it up in my hands, smell it. Yep, it's got that burnt kind of smell to it, especially when it's been raining. It's a little dry right now, and the smells are not as strong. Okay, so this is essentially what you're looking for. Two leaflets coming opposite of one another. You'll notice that sometimes it's actually got two notches at the base, but you'll see that gland and the big leaves. So I call it the palm tree of the north. It looks like very palm tree like. And again, you know, it can come in different forms, which I'll show you in a second. But essentially, right now, there's not a lot of growth that is happening with it. It almost looks like it's reddish right now, but in a couple of weeks, you're going to see that it's going to turn that more greenish color to it. And it almost looks like, I don't know if you've ever seen the cartoon Phineas and Ferb, but it almost looks like their hairstyle a little bit, like coming out during this time. It can also kind of grow in a shrub-like fashion. And again, I can tell this is going to be Tree of Heaven by its seeds. This is actually going to be its seed cluster, or maybe that's the flowers that are coming out. But again, you'll notice that it looks very similar to something. In a second, I'll show you one of its main lookalikes. But the mature trees are actually really obvious. Again, really like growing straight up to heaven, narrow trunk, growing straight up. Like, this is a hazard in my own yard. I've got them growing in my yard because it's got really shallow root structure. The trunk just grows straight up, and then you've got all the palm like leaves up front, and they're really prone to falling down. But this is its main lookalike, right? Are the sumacs. lots of people confuse tree of heaven with sumac. So if you look at this, most people would say, oh, that's sumac, but it's not. And here's how to tell the difference between tree of heaven and sumac. First of all, the sumacs are going to have its fruiting structure is like it has like, you know, the like a fruiting cone. It looks like it's like a little popsicle that's coming up, right? But remember, tree of heaven has the winged seeds. It does not have this structure. The other way to tell the difference, darn it, is that sumacs, I thought I had that in my slide here, but sumacs have serrated edges to their leaves. So write that down in your notes. Sumacs have serrated edges. But remember, tree of heaven does not. It's like smooth at the edges, right? There's no serrated margins except for that notch at the end. Sumacs are serrated all the way through. Okay. So we are on to our last species. This one is called swallowwort. And there's actually two different types of species that you'll be on the lookout for. And versus the other ones that are forest pests or trees or bugs or whatever, this one is actually very low growing and it's an invasive vine. It is actually called in some circles, dog strangling vine. It wraps around things. It's an herbaceous twining vine. And again, you know how the leaflets of tree of heaven come up opposite of one another along the branch? This also has that like almost like a bow tie look to it, dark, shiny, pointed leaves. But this is what you're going to be on the lookout for this month. In a couple of weeks, you're going to see really distinctive flowers that are going to be like a darker purple or like almost like a black, and they're star shaped. If you went out looking for swallowwort later in the season, like in the fall, you'll see that it has very like it almost looks like a let me show you. It almost looks like string beans that are like pods, like almost like resemble pea pods. And you're going to see that is super, super similar to like milkweed, and like in almost every way. But you're not going to see these seed pods anytime soon. That comes out later in the fall. But what you might see right now is a tangled mess of very dark green leaves that are twining around itself and almost like strangling itself that on the ground of the understory so that not much else can grow. And as I want to point out, these flowers, I think this is actually really important and kind of another way in which invasive species can impact a system. So they're very, very similar to milkweed. If you've ever seen a milkweed flower, it looks exactly like this, like exactly like that flower. It's star-shaped and it's got the milky pods. So as we know, milkweed, which is a native species, native plant, monarchs depend upon milkweed. It's the only thing they can feed on. So the females will fly to that. They'll lay their eggs on milkweed. Their caterpillars have to subsist on milkweed. But not only is swallowwort outcompeting milkweed in habitat by taking it over and outcompeting it, it actually tricks milkweed. It has the same chemicals as milkweed does. It tricks monarchs into laying its eggs on it, but the caterpillars cannot feed on basically on the sap of swallowwort, and then they end up not surviving. So not only does it outcompete milkweed, but it actually is a mimic of milkweed in terms of like its chemical scent and stuff, and it's just destroying the monarchs. So it's another reason why we're looking at this. And as I said before, we're not doing just to like survey record, but there has been a lot of movement recently on biocontrol that's now being released out in Eastern Lake Ontario and showing a lot of promise. Swallowwort is actually native to Ukraine, as are these moths. Hypena opulenta moth from the same area, and their larval caterpillar feeds exclusively on swallowwort. And we've seen in areas in which we've released some of these moths in these experimental regions that there's substantial damage being done to swallowwort, because right now there's not a great solution for manually pulling out swallowwort. It's an aggressive resprouter. So this is kind of our best hope for dealing with swallowwort in our area. I'm going to show you a video. Oops. Of swallowwort so that you know what to look for, and then we'll get into final steps for you all so that you can kind of start looking at this stuff. This is, I think I filmed this in May of last year. You'll see it in a second. I've got a vine up here, but it'll turn to swallowwort in a second. little bumpy lenticels as well. Here is a rare sighting of black swallowwort. Actually, as I was walking in Dutchess County, I saw this popping up in the middle of some rocks, and you can just see how hardy this is. You can see the like sort of darker leaves, and if I zoom in close to the flowers, if I can flip this around, you see how it's got those star-shaped flowers? So that's going to be really distinctive. You might not see the flowers right now, but you will in a couple of weeks. And you'll notice that some of these leaves that come out opposite one another, they're almost like heart-shaped, like that's called cordate. Might be a little heart-shaped and dark glossy. And the black appearance. Again, this actually grows like a vine, and over here you can see it almost like twisting around itself. And it's just so interesting. I wanted to film this because you can see what sorts of conditions it's capable of growing in. It's literally just rocks here. And as this continues to grow, you know, you will see that it will continue to sprawl out horizontally, continue to clamber over each other. But just like look at this landscape that it's growing in, and just how hardy of a invasive that this is. So just wanted to point that out. Here in that same park is another look at black swallowwort and how it's growing. You can see also just, you know, you can see that it's leaders that are coming up here looking for purchase. It's kind of angled. Okay, so all vines have what are called leaders. It's like the leading edge of that vine. And all it's looking to do is like almost like a snake or like a cobra that comes out of something and it's looking to wrap around something. So you're always going to see it like coiling up and looking to like twist. And again, just looking for those really like glossy, dark leaves. You can see the difference between that and garlic mustard in the background, just how much darker the leaves are. That's one key characteristic to be looking for. But this just gives you a look at its growth pattern again, like sort of twining around itself. And this is what tends to happen in patches of swallowwort. It's almost like braids. It almost becomes like braids. You see how tightly it's wrapping around once it really starts to grow. It twists and twines and it'll start to grow up, and then eventually it's going to start like bending over and then start growing horizontally. But you can see it's all around this path here, and of course you know, in and amongst poison ivy as well. So just wanted to point it out and how it's growing. And you can see just what happens as I know that sometimes when you look at still, let's see if I can go back to this. Hold on. Because sometimes when you see still pictures, you're like, oh, you can't really tell the scale of things, but like the flowers are really small. Like, look at, that's my thumb right there. And if I zoom in close to the flowers, if I can flip this around, that star-shaped flower again is smaller than my thumbnail. So they're really tiny. Like sometimes when you see a picture up close, you're like expecting this big star-shaped thing. It's not. It's like smaller than your thumbnail. Okay, so that is black swallowwort. And again, we're moving towards like managing that in our region and really want to know what patches would be good viable options for potentially releasing biocontrol in our area so that it doesn't continue to damage our ecosystem. So next steps, I'm going to be in touch. I think most of you are signed up, but in case you are not, there is a follow-up live stream webinar that's going to take place next Wednesday, same time. If you can't attend next Wednesday, again, I'm going to make these recordings available, you know, on demand. And I always find that surveyors always want to kind of like not see the whole thing again, but review certain sections right before you go out surveying. So you'll have access to this webinar and the survey protocol. So next Wednesday is really about like, okay, well, what do my data sheets look like and what do I actually got to record down? But this is the species ID portion. So once you viewed that second webinar, again, that's going to be online next Wednesday. You'll be good to go. You're going to get an assignment. And typically the assignment is like, this should be fun for you all. Like you should be able to like explore and hike on a trail and record these species along a trail section that you're either really concerned about and you want to like feel like you're doing something to protect and preserve, or it just could be an area you want to explore and just like, I want to hike here and see what's growing there and learn. So you're going to get an assignment from us. It takes Christy and I like a few weeks to kind of get assignments out to everyone for a trail section. Usually the trail assignments are going to be like a mile or so, and you're going to be stopping every couple 100 feet to look for these 5 species and then writing it down on a data sheet. And you'll have some like an app you'll be using as well. But you'll have the full summer and even part of the fall to complete it. So a lot, like some people, when they get an assignment, like a mile, 2-mile assignment, they pound it out in a weekend. They just like, I'm going to walk this and do it all in one weekend. And some people go out multiple times, and it takes they just kind of chip away at it, like after work one day or something. And then they come out and do it again for like an hour or something. I would say usually an assignment you have from May or June to September to complete it. I would say all told, maybe like 8 hours or something, 6 hours. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. But that's the investment of time typically it's going to take. And so again, some people do it all in a weekend. Some people take months to do it, which is fine. Either way, it totally works. And it should be in a place that's convenient for you and easy for you to do. And at the end, of course, you're going to get our appreciation. And this goes into a data set that we then can prioritize management in. That's it. That's all I got for you all. So you've been really attentive. We actually ended the informational part right at 8:15, but I'm going to be around for the next 15 minutes to answer questions. I'm actually going to stop the recording, and this is what will be available to you all for, I'll send out a link to this recording so that you'll have it for reference moving forward.